white supremacist, neo-Nazi, and racialist literature constitutes one of the most compact, stable, and interconnected bodies of ideological writing produced over the past century. The 15 titles selected for this essay represent the most frequently referenced, reprinted, distributed, and studied works within these movements. These texts appear consistently in private collections, propaganda distributions, manifestos, reading lists, organized study groups, and both historical and contemporary online repositories. They encompass a wide range of literary forms: political manifestos, autobiographical treatises, dystopian novels, philosophical essays, historical documents, serialized newspaper compilations, and esoteric mystical writings. Their influence is demonstrated by the frequency with which they are quoted, adapted, incorporated into advocacy literature, tactical manuals, and ideological justifications, and preserved through dedicated reprintings and digital archiving. The majority of titles were produced between the early 20th century and the late 1970s, coinciding with periods of major social and political tension. This allows adherents to engage comprehensively with the material, while the diversity of formats, fiction and nonfiction, theoretical and narrative, supports broad accessibility across different audiences and distribution methods. Authors include heads of state, political organizers, novelists, academics, and pseudonymous writers, each contributing unique yet complementary elements that interlink across the collection. The texts serve dual purposes. They provide structured intellectual arguments for racial hierarchy, separation, and renewal, and they offer vivid narrative illustrations that make those arguments emotionally compelling and practically applicable. This combination of doctrinal density and narrative accessibility has enabled the literature to remain relevant and adaptable across changing historical, social, and technological contexts, while maintaining a consistent core of principles centered on racial preservation, societal critique, and visions of future order. The 15 titles. Number 1. The Turner Diaries. Author, William Luther Pierce, writing as Andrew MacDonald. Date, 1978. The novel unfolds as the personal diary of Earl Turner, a dedicated member of a clandestine white supremacist group known as the Organization. Set in a dystopian future, it portrays a United States under the grip of a federal government dominated by Jewish interests, enforcing policies of racial integration and disarmament that provoke widespread resistance among white nationalists. Turner documents his initial involvement, highlighting the group's frustration with societal decay and their decision to form secret cells to challenge the regime through subversive means. As the narrative progresses, Turner details the escalation of their operations, beginning with the acquisition of firearms and explosives from sympathetic sources. The group launches coordinated attacks, including bombings of key federal installations, such as the FBI headquarters and the Pentagon, using stolen nuclear materials to amplify destruction. These acts aim to destabilize the government and inspire a broader uprising, framing violence as essential to reclaiming national sovereignty from perceived oppressors. The story reaches its climax with the Day of the Rope, a mass execution of individuals deemed race traitors, including journalists, politicians, and interracial couples. Following this purge, the organization expands its territorial control through systematic ethnic cleansing, deploying nuclear, chemical, and biological weapons to eliminate non-white populations globally. The diary concludes with the establishment of a new white-dominated world order, emphasizing themes of racial loyalty and the triumph of revolutionary will. Number 2. Mein Kampf. Author, Adolf Hitler. Date, 1925, Volume 1, 1927, Volume 2. The two-volume work integrates Adolf Hitler's personal autobiography with a detailed political program for National Socialism. Composed during his imprisonment following the Beer Hall Putsch, it lays out foundational ideas on race, state organization, and foreign policy. The text emphasizes the role of ideology in mobilizing masses and establishing a racially homogeneous society. Volume 1 focuses on Hitler's formative years, detailing his time in Vienna, where poverty and exposure to diverse populations shaped his anti-Semitic and racial views. It covers his service in World War I, portraying the conflict as a crucible for German nationalism. The narrative develops arguments blaming Jewish influence for Germany's defeat and post-war chaos, framing race as the central force in history. Volume 2 expands on a National Socialist platform, advocating territorial expansion into Eastern Europe for living space. It discusses propaganda as a tool for shaping public opinion and the need for absolute leadership under the Führer principle. The establishment of a folkish state prioritizes racial principles, eugenics, and alliances to secure Aryan dominance. Number 3. Siege. Author, James Mason. Date, Essays from the 1980s, compiled 1992. James Mason's Siege compiles essays from the 1980s, originally published in newsletters associated with the National Socialist Liberation Front. The work positions itself as a guide for radical action in an era where traditional organizational structures have failed. Mason argues that the existing system, viewed as irredeemably controlled by opposing forces, requires deliberate efforts to accelerate its downfall rather than gradual reform. Central to the essays is the concept of leaderless resistance, where individuals or small autonomous cells operate without centralized command to avoid detection and infiltration. This approach encourages spontaneous and unpredictable acts aimed at sowing chaos and weakening institutional stability. Mason rejects participation in electoral politics or mass movements, seeing them as traps that dilute revolutionary potential and integrate dissidents into the system they oppose. The collection embraces alliances with unconventional or disruptive elements, including those outside strict ideological boundaries, to amplify disorder. Through this lens, violence becomes a tool for total opposition, with the ultimate goal of creating conditions for a new order to emerge from the ruins. The compiled edition includes additional commentary that reinforces these strategies for contemporary application. Number 4. White Power. Author, George Lincoln Rockwell. Date, 1967. George Lincoln Rockwell's White Power, published in 1967, outlines a comprehensive program for advancing white racial supremacy within the United States. Rockwell, as the founder of the American Nazi Party, uses the book to detail his personal journey and the party's establishment in 1959. He positions the organization as a vehicle for direct confrontation with what he perceives as threats to white dominance. The text includes sharp critiques of the civil rights movement, framing it as a tool of external manipulation designed to undermine American society. Rockwell argues that integration and equality initiatives erode traditional structures, advocating instead for complete racial separation to maintain cultural and genetic integrity. Rockwell calls for the deportation of non-white populations and the implementation of National Socialist principles through structured, disciplined efforts. He emphasizes recruitment, propaganda, and organizational tactics to achieve governance aligned with these ideals, presenting the party as the means to secure lasting power for the white race. Number 5. The Protocols of the Elders of Zion. Author, Anonymous. Date, 1903, Russian original. English editions from the 1920s. The Protocols of the Elders of Zion originated in Russia in 1903, later translated into English and popularized in the 1920s through various editions. The document structures itself as records from gatherings of Jewish leaders, convened to devise a comprehensive scheme for achieving worldwide dominance. These meetings as part of a long-term, multi-generational effort to subvert existing societal orders. The core content delineates methods for infiltrating and controlling key institutions, including finance systems through debt and speculation, media outlets to shape public opinion, and educational frameworks to influence thought. It describes engineering social upheavals, such as revolutions and wars to weaken nations, while promoting ideologies like liberalism and atheism to erode traditional values and moral foundations. The text emphasizes gradual, insidious tactics to avoid detection. The protocols outline the establishment of a centralized supergovernment ruled by a single authority, with all opposition eliminated through surveillance, economic pressure, and orchestrated crises. This vision culminates in absolute control over global resources and populations, ensuring perpetual authority through sustained manipulation of cultural and political landscapes. 6. Might is Right. Author, Ragnar Redbeard, pseudonym. Date, 1890, revised editions 1910. Might is Right, authored under the pseudonym Ragnar Redbeard and first published in 1890 with revised editions in 1910, presents a philosophical defense of amoral power dynamics. The text posits that true morality derives solely from strength and evolutionary processes, where the powerful naturally prevail over the weak. This framework draws on social Darwinist principles to argue that human societies function best under laws of conquest rather than contrived ethical systems. The work systematically rejects Christian morality as a tool of the feeble, dismissing compassion, equality, and democratic ideals as illusions that hinder progress. Instead, it champions hierarchies based on physical and mental superiority, advocating unrestricted dominance by elite stocks. Superior individuals and races, according to the narrative, hold inherent rights to conquer, reproduce, and eliminate competitors without remorse or restraint. This doctrine extends to critiques of modern institutions, portraying them as enfeebling mechanisms that protect the unfit. The book's uncompromising tone influenced later racialist thought, emphasizing survival through raw force as the ultimate arbiter of right and wrong in human affairs. 7. The Camp of the Saints. Author, Jean Raspail. Date, 1973. The novel unfolds with a massive armada of dilapidated ships departing from India, laden with 1 million impoverished migrants seeking refuge in the prosperous West. As the fleet approaches the French Mediterranean coast, the story shifts to the reactions of French society, where initial reports spark a mix of humanitarian concern and alarm among officials and the public. The migrants, driven by desperation, symbolize an overwhelming influx that tests the limits of European hospitality and resources. European leaders convene in urgent debates, weighing options from military interception to open welcome, while intellectuals and media figures advocate for compassion amid fears of cultural dilution. The narrative explores individual characters, a government minister grappling with policy, a philosopher pondering civilization's fate, and ordinary citizens facing disruption as the arrival looms. Tensions escalate as border defenses weaken under political indecision, leading to chaotic landings and the spread of migrants inland. The influx precipitates societal unraveling, with institutions straining under the pressure of integration demands. Cultural norms erode as European traditions confront the newcomers' ways, resulting in economic strain, social unrest, and the eventual transformation of Western structures. The book concludes with a vision of a fundamentally altered Europe, where the weight of migration reshapes demographics and power dynamics across the continent. 8. Imperium. Author, Francis Parker Yockey, writing as Ulick Varange. Date, 1948. Francis Parker Yockey's Imperium, published in 1948 under the pseudonym Ulick Varange, presents a comprehensive vision for the revival of European civilization in the aftermath of World War II. The text argues for the creation of a unified European imperium, a political and cultural entity that transcends national boundaries to embody the collective destiny of the white race. Yockey critiques the fragmentation caused by the war and positions this imperium as a necessary response to the dominance of American materialism and Soviet communism, which he views as alien forces eroding European spiritual integrity. The book employs a cyclical analysis of history, drawing on the concept of cultural organisms where civilizations rise, mature, and decline like living entities. Yockey applies this framework to trace the development of Western culture, emphasizing the role of racial and spiritual elements in its vitality. He identifies the 20th century as a period of crisis, marked by the loss of imperial will and the intrusion of extra-European influences, and proposes a return to organic unity through disciplined leadership. At its core, Imperium advocates authoritarian socialism led by a spiritual elite dedicated to racial preservation and cultural renewal. This system rejects liberal democracy and capitalism, favoring a hierarchical order that aligns with natural laws of strength and destiny. Yaki calls for expansion eastward to secure living space and resources, framing this as essential for the white race's long-term survival against global threats. The work concludes with a call to action for Europeans to reclaim their historical role as bearers of high culture. 9. The International Jew. Author, Henry Ford. Date, 1920 to 1922 series, compiled as book. The International Jew originated as a series of articles published in Henry Ford's newspaper, the Dearborn Independent, between 1920 and 1922. Compiled into 4 volumes as a book, the work reflects Ford's interest in social and economic issues during the post-World War I era. It draws on various sources to present a systematic examination of patterns in global affairs. The series focuses on Jewish roles in banking institutions, such as international finance houses, and their impact on national economies. It extends to media control, claiming influence over newspapers and entertainment to shape public opinion. Political spheres receive attention, with analyses of events like revolutions and government policies attributed to coordinated efforts. The overall argument posits that these influences aim to undermine host nations through financial dependency, cultural shifts, and ideological dissemination. The text advocates awareness and countermeasures to preserve national sovereignty and traditional values in economic and social domains. 10. White America. Author, Ernest Severe Cox. Date, 1926. White America by Ernest Severe Cox, published in 1926, presents a detailed case for maintaining racial homogeneity in the United States. Cox, an American ethnographer and racial theorist, contends that the white population's genetic integrity faces erosion through demographic shifts and social policies. The book positions white racial stock as the foundation of American civilization, arguing that its dilution threatens national stability and cultural achievements. Cox advocates repatriation of Black Americans to Africa as a primary solution, viewing it as a humane and logical reversal of historical translocation. He proposes stringent legal measures to prohibit intermarriage between races, framing such unions as biologically detrimental. These recommendations aim to establish clear racial boundaries within the country. The arguments draw on historical accounts of racial interactions and biological data from early eugenics research. Cox uses observations from colonial periods and scientific studies to support segregation as a protective mechanism. The text promotes eugenic practices to enhance desirable traits, emphasizing controlled reproduction and immigration restrictions to preserve racial composition. 11. The Myth of the 20th Century. Author, Alfred Rosenberg. Date, 1930. Alfred Rosenberg's The Myth of the 20th Century, published in 1930, positions the Aryan racial soul as the foundational force behind all significant cultural and civilizational achievements throughout history. Rosenberg argues that the Nordic race possesses an innate creative vitality that manifests in art, philosophy, and statecraft, distinguishing it from other groups. This racial essence, he contends, drives historical progress and must be recognized as the core of European identity to counteract degenerative influences. The book delivers a sharp critique of Christianity, portraying it as a Semitic intrusion that has diluted the pure Nordic spirit with foreign dogmas of universalism and humility. Rosenberg views Christian teachings as antithetical to Aryan values of strength and heroism, imposed through historical conquest and leading to spiritual alienation. He calls for a rejection of these elements in favor of a return to pre-Christian Germanic myths and pagan traditions that align with racial instincts. Advocating a revival of Nordic spiritual values, the work emphasizes racial hygiene through eugenics to preserve genetic quality and Eastern expansion to secure living space for the Aryan people. Rosenberg envisions a new order where state policies enforce these principles, ensuring the race's dominance and cultural renewal. This framework influenced National Socialist ideology, framing racial policy as essential to historical destiny. 12. Which Way Western Man? Author, William Gailey Simpson. Date, 1978. William Gailey Simpson's Which Way Western Man, published in 1978, presents a comprehensive critique of Western civilization's trajectory, attributing its decline to the pervasive influences of egalitarianism and Christian ethics. Simpson argues that these forces have eroded the natural order by promoting universal brotherhood and moral constraints that stifle individual excellence and societal strength. Drawing from his personal evolution from pacifism to racialist philosophy, the book examines historical and cultural shifts that have led to what he views as a weakening of European-derived societies. The text advocates a return to Nietzschean principles, emphasizing the will to power as the driving force for human advancement. Simpson calls for the cultivation of an aristocratic elite through selective breeding and education, rejecting mass democracy as a system that empowers the mediocre at the expense of the superior. He posits that natural hierarchies, rooted in biological and cultural differences, must be restored to ensure the vitality of Western peoples. In its advocacy for racial selection and hierarchical governance, the book positions itself as a guide for reclaiming Western destiny. Simpson's arguments integrate philosophical insights with calls for practical measures, urging readers to prioritize strength, discipline, and heritage over inclusive ideals. This work has found resonance in circles seeking alternatives to modern egalitarian structures. 13. The Hoax of the 20th Century. Author, Arthur Butts. Date, 1976. Arthur Butts's The Hoax of the 20th Century, published in 1976, presents a detailed examination of World War II historical records. As an associate professor of electrical engineering at Northwestern University, Butts applies technical analysis to challenge established narratives surrounding Nazi policies toward Jews. The book scrutinizes a range of sources, including official documents from concentration camps, Allied reports, and post-war trials, to question the scale and methods of alleged extermination programs. Central to Butts's argument is the evaluation of demographic statistics, gas chamber blueprints, and eyewitness testimonies. He contends that discrepancies in population figures before and after the war do not support claims of 6 million deaths. Instead, he posits that many losses resulted from disease, starvation, and wartime displacements rather than deliberate genocide. The text analyzes Zyklon B usage, crematoria capacities, and transportation logs to suggest technical impossibilities in the described operations. Ultimately, Butts concludes that the extermination story emerged as Allied propaganda to justify the war and post-war actions. He frames it as a constructed myth perpetuated through media and education, calling for historical revision based on empirical evidence. The book has circulated widely in revisionist circles, influencing debates on wartime events. 14. Hunter. Author, William Luther Pierce. Writing as Andrew MacDonald. Date, 1989. The novel centers on Oscar Yeager, a Vietnam veteran turned lone assassin in a near-future America dominated by racial tensions. Yeager methodically targets individuals he views as threats to white racial integrity, including Jewish leaders, interracial couples, and government officials enforcing immigration policies. Pierce constructs the narrative as a series of missions, emphasizing Yeager's transformation from isolated vigilante to mentor figure. Yeager employs sophisticated evasion tactics, such as forged identities, surveillance countermeasures, and hit-and-run strategies to avoid capture. The story details his recruitment of like-minded individuals, forming loose networks for support without centralized organization. Pierce incorporates practical advice on weaponry, explosives, and psychological preparation, presenting these as essential skills in a prolonged struggle. Set within an ongoing racial conflict, the book portrays society as on the brink of collapse due to forced diversity. Yeager's actions symbolize individual resistance against systemic forces, culminating in broader implications for revolutionary warfare. The narrative reinforces themes of personal agency in racial preservation efforts. 15. The Lightning and the Sun. Author, Savitri Devi. Date, 1958. Savitri Devi's The Lightning and the Sun, published in 1958, stands as a cornerstone of esoteric racial ideology, blending Hindu philosophy with National Socialist admiration. Devi, born Maximiani Julia Portis in France to Greek and English parents, adopted her pseudonym to reflect devotion to Hindu traditions. The book categorizes historical figures based on their relationship to time and cosmic cycles, drawing from ancient myths to frame human action within eternal patterns of creation, maintenance, and destruction. Devi divides leaders into men in time, who embody destructive forces like Genghis Khan, men above time, enlightened preservers such as Akhenaten, and men against time, who accelerate decay to hasten renewal, exemplified by Adolf Hitler. Hitler receives central focus as a modern avatar, combining lightning's swift devastation with the sun's regenerative power. Devi portrays him as a necessary agent in the Kali Yuga, the current age of decline, whose actions clear the path for a new golden era. The text integrates Hindu cyclical history, where ages repeat in a cosmic wheel, emphasizing violence as an essential tool for racial and spiritual rebirth. Devi argues that true renewal demands ruthless elimination of degenerative elements, positioning National Socialism as aligned with divine order. This fusion of Eastern mysticism and Western racialism has influenced subsequent thinkers in the movement, offering a metaphysical justification for radical change. Grouping the titles by thematic focus. The 15 titles cluster naturally into 5 primary subject categories based on form and primary emphasis. Political manifestos and governance programs. Mein Kampf, White Power, and Imperium provide detailed blueprints for racial states, leadership structures, propaganda methods, and territorial policies. Dystopian and revolutionary fiction. The Turner Diaries, Hunter, and the Camp of the Saints create narrative scenarios of societal collapse and racial conflict to illustrate ideological points in concrete, emotionally engaging form. Anti-Semitic conspiracy and economic analysis. The Protocols of the Elders of Zion and the International Jew focus on coordinated Jewish influence in finance, media, and politics. Philosophical, esoteric, and racial mysticism. The Myth of the 20th Century, Which Way Western Man, The Lightning and the Sun, and Might Is Right explore spiritual, cyclical, and power-based justifications for racial hierarchy and renewal. Historical and scientific racialism. The Hoax of the 20th Century, White America, and Siege examine demographic data, historical records, wartime evidence, and tactical strategies to support core racial claims. This grouping demonstrates how the canon balances theoretical foundations, narrative inspiration, and practical application across different emphases. Recurring and common themes across the canon. Racial hierarchy appears uniformly, with whites or Aryans positioned as creators and preservers of civilization, while other groups are presented as threats to that order. Anti-Semitism functions as a central explanatory mechanism in nearly every title, linking Jewish influence to economic control, cultural decay, and political manipulation. Violence is consistently framed as a legitimate and often necessary instrument for racial renewal, ranging from organized revolutionary campaigns to individual acts of assassination. Anti-democratic governance recurs as a critique of systems that dilute white interests through equality and pluralism. Preservation strategies, eugenics, segregation, territorial claims, and repatriation form practical recommendations across genres. Mystical and cyclical interpretations of history provide philosophical grounding, connecting contemporary struggles to eternal patterns of rise, decline, and rebirth. These themes form an interconnected structure. Anti-Semitism explains the source of decline. Racial hierarchy justifies separation. Violence enables renewal, and mystical history supplies eternal legitimacy. Thematic cross-analysis of essential white supremacist literature. White supremacist literature exhibits recurring themes that reinforce racial hierarchies, anti-Semitism, and calls for revolutionary action. This analysis compares and cross-references key motifs across the 15 core titles, drawing connections in their portrayals of racial purity, anti-egalitarianism, violence as necessity, anti-democratic governance, and mystical or historical justifications. Themes interlink, with earlier works like Mein Kampf influencing later ones, such as the Turner Diaries, creating a cohesive ideological framework. Racial hierarchy and preservation. All titles prioritize racial purity as the foundation of society, viewing non-whites, especially Jews, as inferior or destructive. Mein Kampf establishes Aryans as culture creators and Jews as parasites, a motif echoed in the myth of the 20th century, which expands into spiritual dimensions of Nordic blood. Might is Right justifies this through social Darwinism, where strong races dominate weak ones, cross-referenced in white America's eugenics arguments for segregating and repatriating blacks to prevent degeneration. The Turner Diaries and Hunter operationalize this by depicting extermination of non-whites via nuclear and chemical means, paralleling the Camp of the Saints invasion narrative where mass migration overwhelms European racial stock. White power applies it to American contexts, advocating deportation, while Imperium envisions a unified white European empire to preserve racial destiny against extra-European forces. Which Way Western Man critiques Christianity for undermining racial selection, linking to the Lightning and the Sun's cyclical view of Hitler as an avatar renewing Aryan dominance. Anti-Semitic texts like the Protocols of the Elders of Zion and the International Jew frame Jews as the primary threat to white hierarchy, a theme revised in the hoax of the 20th century. Siege accelerates this by urging total war to enforce racial order. Anti-Semitism and conspiracy. Elements of anti-Semitism permeates in each title, accurately portraying Jews as manipulators of finance, media, and governments. The Protocols of the Elders of Zion sets the template with the plans for world domination via wars and moral decay, directly referenced in the International Jews documentation of Jewish control over Hollywood and banking. Mein Kampf builds on this, elucidating on the Jews' involvement in Germany's problems and Marxism, influencing white power's depiction of civil rights as Jewish plots. The Turner Diaries and Hunter feature assassinations of Jewish figures as heroic acts, cross-referencing Siege's call for lone wolf attacks on system enablers. The myth of the 20th century spiritualizes it, viewing Judaism as antithetical to Aryan soul, paralleled in Imperium's anti-Semitic purge for European unity. The hoax of the 20th century defends this by denying fake Holocaust evidence as ally propaganda. Might is Right mocks Jewish morality as weakness, while The Lightning and the Sun elevates Hitler as destroyer of Jewish influence. White America extends it to broader non-white threats, but ties back to Jewish orchestration of integration. Violence and revolution. Violence as a tool for racial renewal is discussed, with revolution framed as inevitable. The Turner Diaries glorifies bombings and ethnic cleansing, inspiring Siege's accelerationism for system collapse through unpredictable terror. Mein Kampf advocates armed struggle for Lebensraum, cross-referenced in Imperium's mobilization against communism. White Power details street confrontations for power, echoing Hunter's lone assassin tactics. Might is Right celebrates war and plunder as natural, influencing The Lightning and the Sun's portrayal of destruction as cosmic necessity. The Camp of the Saints depicts passive resistance leading to downfall, implying violence as the only response to invasion. The myth of the 20th century justifies it through racial destiny, while Which Way Western Man calls for elite-led upheaval against degeneracy. Anti-democracy and authoritarianism. Democracy is consistently portrayed as a Jewish deception that weakens white societies by promoting equality and pluralism. Mein Kampf critiques parliamentary systems as inefficient and corrupt, advocating absolute Führer leadership as the ideal model for racial governance. This emphasis on strong, centralized authority reappears in White Power, which calls for a national socialist revolution to replace democratic institutions with disciplined racial rule. Siege rejects electoral participation entirely, favoring leaderless violence and unpredictable terrorism to collapse the system, while cross-referencing Imperium's vision of authoritarian socialism under a spiritual elite. Might is Right dismisses equality as slave morality that stifles natural hierarchies, an idea echoed in white America's support for anti-miscegenation laws and racial separation. The Protocols of the Elders of Zion and the International Jew depict democracy as a manipulation tool used to undermine host nations through division and weakness. Mysticism and historical. Mystical and historical elements recur throughout the canon, blending interpretations of the past with esoteric or spiritual justifications for racial hierarchy. The myth of the 20th century promotes Aryan paganism as a superior alternative to Christianity, framing Nordic spiritual values as the true source of cultural greatness. This emphasis on pre-Christian mysticism directly influences the lightning and the sun, which casts Adolf Hitler as a divine avatar of renewal within Hindu cyclical cosmology. Imperium employs cultural organicism to present history as the life cycle of racial civilizations, envisioning a unified European empire as the destined restoration of white dominance. Which Way Western Man cross-references this by applying Nietzschean critique to reject egalitarian and Christian influences, advocating aristocratic racial selection. White America invokes historical racial science to support segregation and eugenics, while the Camp of the Saints employs apocalyptic prophecy to depict mass migration as civilization's end. The Protocols of the Elders of Zion revel as ancient conspiratorial plots, an idea extended in the International Jew through references to long-standing Jewish orchestration of societal decline. These elements collectively provide an eternal, metaphysical validation for racial supremacy, portraying current struggles as part of timeless patterns of rise, declaration, and rebirth. Thematic cross-analysis. The 15 core titles form an interconnected ideological framework where recurring themes reinforce a unified, supremacist worldview. Racial hierarchy and preservation constitute the foundational principle, consistently presented as the natural order across all works. Anti-Semitism serves as an explanatory mechanism, attributing societal decline to Jewish manipulation of finance, media, politics, and culture. Violence emerges as the essential instrument for racial renewal, framed as both inevitable and justified whether through organized revolution or individual action. Anti-democratic governance is critiqued as a deceptive system that weakens white interests by promoting equality and pluralism. Mystical and historical elements provide eternal validation, linking contemporary struggles to timeless cycles of racial destiny and rebirth. These themes interweave seamlessly. Anti-Semitism identifies the source of corruption. Hierarchy justifies separation. Violence enables restoration. Anti-democratic critique rejects existing structures, and mystical history supplies transcendent purpose. Together, they create a cohesive system of thought that connects doctrinal argument, narrative illustration, and philosophical depth into a single, self-reinforcing worldview. Literary and research analysis. The canon of 15 titles exhibits clear patterns of author overlap and production method that reflect the movement's emphasis on continuity, accessibility, and responsiveness to crises. William Luther Pierce authored 2 entries, The Turner Diaries and Hunter, creating a direct narrative sequence that begins with collective revolutionary action in the first and shifts to lone wolf operations in the second, providing adherents with complementary models for different phases of struggle. Several other titles originated as serialized publications before compilation into book form. The International Jew began as a series of articles in Henry Ford's Dearborn Independent newspaper, while the Turner Diaries was initially released in installments through distribution channels. This serialized approach allowed incremental dissemination to a dispersed audience, building anticipation and enabling wider reach before final publication. The method also reflects a historical preference for accessible, episodic delivery that could be shared through newsletters, pamphlets, or word of mouth in pre-digital networks. Publication dates cluster around periods of major social and political upheaval, indicating the literature responds to contemporary events and existential threats to white racial or cultural continuity. Mein Kampf appeared in the mid-1920s amid Germany's post-World War I instability. The International Jew in the early 1920s during economic recovery and Jewish manipulations in the United States. The Camp of the Saints in 1973 amid growing immigration debates in Europe, and Siege in the 1980s during heightened right-leaning mobilizations in America. The presence of both fiction and nonfiction within the canon enables the literature to fulfill multiple functions. Novels such as The Turner Diaries, Hunter, and The Camp of the Saints provide emotional inspiration through vivid scenarios of conflict and renewal, while treatises like Mein Kampf, Imperium, and W. Hitchway, Westermann delivered doctrinal instruction through systematic argument. Distribution historically relied on a combination of newspaper serialization, self-publishing, small dedicated presses, mail networks, and, in later decades, digital archiving. Early titles spread through Ford's own newspaper and subsequent pamphlet reprints, while post-war works depended on limited-run editions circulated within right-wing organizations. Networks ensured availability in libraries and private collections, where texts could be studied in isolation. The canon's limited size, only 15 core titles, facilitates comprehensive study within small reading circles or individual research, yet offers sufficient depth for prolonged ideological engagement. Longevity among many authors correlates strongly with those whose primary role was intellectual production rather than direct organizational leadership or public confrontation. Figures such as William Gailey Simpson, died at 98, Ernest Severe Cox, 86, Gene Raspail, 94, and Arthur Butts, still alive in his 90s, focused on writing and theory, experiencing natural deaths in advanced age. In contrast, authors engaged in active leadership or high-visibility roles. Adolf Hitler, suicide at 56, George Lincoln Rockwell, assassinated at 49, Alfred Rosenberg, executed at 53, and Francis Parker Yockey, suicide in custody at 42, met abrupt, violent ends. This pattern suggests that intellectual authorship provided greater personal safety and longevity compared to frontline activism. Conclusion: enduring legacy. The canon's cohesive role in ideological continuity. The 15 titles constitute a stable, interconnected, and enduring body of literature that has supplied doctrinal, narrative, philosophical, and tactical resources for white supremacist, neo-Nazi, and racialist thought across multiple generations. From foundational political programs and governance blueprints to dystopian novels, anti-Semitic conspiracy analyses, philosophical and esoteric treatises, and historical examinations, the works collectively address racial preservation, societal critique, and visions of renewal through a consistent set of thematic elements. Their compact number facilitates comprehensive engagement, while their diverse formats support broad accessibility across different audiences, reading levels, and distribution methods. The author's life trajectories reflect varied paths within the movement, from high-profile political activism and organizational leadership to solitary intellectual production and esoteric exploration, with outcomes ranging from natural longevity in advanced age to abrupt endings through suicide, execution, assassination, or illness. The canon's persistence demonstrates its capacity to transmit core ideas through changing historical, social, and technological contexts, maintaining relevance through reprinting, digital archiving, and continued study. These texts remain central reference points, offering structured arguments, illustrative stories, philosophical justifications, and tactical models that continue to inform ideological development within the movement. The interconnected themes, racial hierarchy, anti-Semitism, violence as renewal, anti-democratic critique, and mystical historical framing, create a unified ideological worldview that has proven resilient and adaptable, ensuring the Canon's continued role as a foundational resource for adherents seeking intellectual and narrative reinforcement of their beliefs.